Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's 12:10. Good afternoon. My name is Vladimír Dlouhý. I'm international advisor to Goldman Sachs, former Minister of Economy and Industry and Trade of this country. And I'm very pleased and honored that I have been asked by the organizers of Forum 2000 to chair this extraordinary panel on a topic which is very proper in today's world and which we all tend to discuss all the time and which we will probably not conclude successfully today, but nevertheless, we have two excellent and extraordinary speakers. The plan of the panel is as follows. After a short introduction, I will give floor to both panelists to have up to 15 minutes the introductory remark. Then we have jointly agreed on a couple of points to discuss, and obviously I will also allow for some discussion. One word of warning, your moderator is teaching from 2 p.m. intermediate course of macroeconomics at Charles University, and I consider teaching the students even more important than panels with the Nobel Prize winners. I hope, Joe, you agree with me, because teaching the students is a sacred thing. So I'm going to finish at 1:40 p.m. sharp. So without any other ado, let me go ahead and let me first introduce Professor Joseph Stiglitz. That is extremely difficult to introduce not only Joe Stiglitz, but both of our panelists. If you Wikipedia them, you will get such a bunch of pages if you print it on both of them. Both of them are well-known economists. Professor Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize holder for economics. He has a very extensive academic research beyond him. He is one of the most known and vocal economists in today's world. But not only that, Professor Stiglitz has also a very strong record of the participation in the public sector, being chairman of the economic advisors to presidents of the United States, being chief economist for the World Bank, and many other positions. You might disagree with Professor Stiglitz, but I would like to use this opportunity and to pay my deep respect both for the academic achievement and also for the vigor with which you are pursuing your views, despite the fact there might be a lot of not misunderstanding, but disagreement between two of us. Joe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. What I want to do is, this particular discussion is a continuation in some sense of the discussion we had last night. Everybody's in favor in some sense of a rule of law. The question is, what kind of rule of law? How do we construct it? How do we make sure that we actually have a just rule of law? Because as I pointed out last night, rules of law can be used to maintain injustice, inequities. In the case of the United States, we had Jim Crow laws. In the case of credit markets in the United States, the legal framework has been used to throw people out of their houses even when they don't owe money. We've introduced in the United States a form of indentured servitude, where if people get too much debt, they have to work the rest of their life, giving 25% of their income to banks with no discharge. There is a really incredible possibility of using rule of law as a mechanism of oppression. And so one has to understand that history to understand it's not an objection to the rule of law, but an emphasis of what kind of rule of law, how is the rule of law enforced. So I ended my talk by pointing out that if we're going to have an effective rule of law, we have to have transparency, we have to have democratic accountability, we have to have a recognition of certain basic rights. So I want to focus, this discussion this morning focuses on one aspect of the rule of law, which is property rights. And we have to understand that all property rights are accompanied by restrictions, and there ought to be responsibilities with rights. And quite often we forget that kind of balance. Let me give you an example. An owner of a property has to, in most societies, there are certain rights of way, the ability to trespass under certain conditions. So it's not an unfettered right. All rights are accompanied by restrictions. And there are also responsibilities. For instance, if you own property, you cannot make it a toxic waste dump, because if you do, that will have effect on neighbors. And that is the basic principle of all law. The reason we have regulations is because what one individual does can harm others. And so your rights are really, have to be seen in light of the consequences to others. Your exercise of liberty can lead to the deprivation of liberty of others. And the regulatory system is supposed to balance those various rights and responsibilities. The movement which Hernando has been very influential in, which is titling, making sure that people have these property rights, has been a very important one, I think when done right, it really can help the well-being of those at the bottom. But I want to put that initiative in broader perspective. So I'm not criticizing it. What I really want to do is see it within a broader perspective concerning three objectives. How do we promote growth? How do we promote poverty reduction? How do we promote access to credit as one of the mechanisms for both growth and poverty reduction? Now, in all three of these areas, titling, giving better property rights, is neither necessary nor sufficient in accomplishing these objectives, these ultimate or intermediate objectives. For instance, property rights in China are not clear, often ambiguous, but China has had the strongest record in terms of economic growth and poverty alleviation. Hundreds of millions of people have been moved out of poverty. Maybe they would have done better if they had had better property rights. That's a debatable question, but certainly they succeeded where other elements played a more important role, property rights played a less important role. As another example, I'm going to talk about a little bit more. In terms of access to credit, there are alternative models for generating access to credit. One based on, you might call it the formal law system, the kind of proposals, the initiative that Hernando's been pushing. The other one is also one originating from the emerging markets, developing countries, is the microcredit, the Grameen Bank example. And what's interesting is these are two very different models based on a different set of principles, increasingly principles that are seen as complementary, but I want to just for a moment contrast. The Grameen model is not based on formal law, but on social capital, on informal. They're not contracts, there's understandings, there's no collateral. It's based on group lending, where the group that you participate in enforces, in effect, the contract, rather than collateral based on land. We've done a study at Columbia contrasting the success of the two models of generating credit, both in terms of the effectiveness in extending credit and the equity, to the extent to which it extends credit to the very poor, and the role that it's played in a whole variety of other social objectives. An important principle here is that what works in one context, what's important in one context, may not work in another. So that when we think about the problems of poverty alleviation, problems of extending credit, it is very important to be very sensitive to the context in which these problems are being addressed, and what might work in one country may not work in another. In Bangladesh, the microcredit scheme has been enormously successful in extending credit. Interestingly, it's also been enormously successful in poverty alleviation. So successful, this almost never happens, that the impacts have been felt at the macroeconomic level. We have lots of experiments where we have impacts on a few individuals. Almost never do they show up in the aggregate statistics. In the case of the initiatives, and it's not just Grameen, it's BRAC, it's a whole set of microcredit institutions which have spread around the whole country, they have had an enormous social and economic impact in that country. What is clear is that that model has worked well in Bangladesh. It has worked well not only for extending credit very extensively, but worked well for reducing poverty and for developing, this is a loose concept, we don't have time to develop, but social capital. In other words, it has really changed the social dynamics. It has been very important in extending the rights of women. That explicitly part of their, it was conceived not just as a credit program, but as a program aimed at the poorest of the poor and changing the nature of the society, so that women would have more economic rights. The balance of economic powers would change. Like one aspect of it was that they decided that it was important, the old systems where you could get divorced by the male saying, I divorced thee 3 times, that was against the law. They changed the Constitution, but they said we actually have to implement it. How do we change the culture? Well, what they did is they decided that you could get a mortgage, but it had to be in the name of the woman. And when they did that, that changed society. Because then when he said, I divorced thee 3 times, she said, leave the house. And that changed the balance of power and changed what happened. So it was a very clear concept of what was involved in changing society. When that idea got transplanted, spread around the world, sometimes it worked.
Když tuto myšlenku potom rozšířili jinde do světa, tak někde to fungovalo, někde ne. Někdy se ztratilo to podstatné. Jedna věc, proč ta záležitost byla tak úspěšná, byla ta, že to nebylo kvůli získání zisku, bylo to hnutí v rámci občanské společnosti. A když to potom přesunulo do jiných zemí, jako Indie, kde do toho vstoupil prvek zisku, tak ten model se změnil. A to, co měli pak v Indii, byla jejich verze amerických problémů s nekvalitními subprime hypotékami. Tam prostě se přišlo na to, že chudé lidi je možné dále vykořisťovat. A mikroúvěry, k těm se přistupovalo podobně jako v Americe k subprime hypotékám. Takže namísto pomoci chudým, chudí klesali.
So not of prosperity, but impoverization. Well, it's the same problem in a way with titling programs. When people have rights to land, you can circumscribe those rights in a variety of ways. In some countries, people have the right to collateralize the produce of the land, what's produced, but not to collateralize the land itself. Now, why would you not do that? Because not collateralizing the land means that you can't unleash as much credit. The argument is the following, that if people can collateralize the land, borrow against it, and there's a bad harvest or something untoward happens, their parents get sick, they have to borrow, they can lose their land. And if they lose their land, they lose their means of livelihood, and they become landless laborers. And the landless in all societies are the worst off. And from an economic point of view, it actually introduces an inefficiency. Because landless workers, say in many countries, engage in what is called sharecropping. It's a system where you share the proceeds of the land with the workers, the tenants, the people who work it, getting 50% of the proceeds. It's like a 50% tax. And it squashes incentives and squashes, it leads to impoverization. It introduces an agency problem and introduces an important inefficiency, and the result is the economy is less productive. So the bottom line is that in very poor countries, without adequate social protections, where weather is variable, that unfettered property rights, unlimited collateralization can lead to impoverization. And therefore, one has to be very careful about extending the use of collateral in these markets. There are a couple just other prefatory remarks that I want to make. The first is that every society has a rule of law, and when we say it doesn't, it often is because we don't really understand the implicit laws that they have. And quite often what goes on is what we want to do is formalize, clarify, make it clearer. And for the most part, that's a good idea, but one has to, again, be very careful about the downside risks and measure the benefits with the cost. Let me just give you one example that highlights the difficulties. In one African country that I know of, there were traditional land rights. They were called customary land rights, and the land was controlled in a matrilineal society. Okay, in a matrilineal society, so it would go through the woman. But when they went to formalize it, have land registration, the tradition was that it was the man who interacted with the state. So the process of formalization was done by the males. So the registration system was a male-dominated registration system, and then you had a conflict between a matrilineal customary law and a patrilineal formal law, and the system turned out not to work well at all. But there's a general point here. Every system of formalization, if it actually is introducing clarity, is a redistribution. Because even the reduction of uncertainty and elimination of ambiguity is, in effect, a redistribution. So the process of formalization itself redistributes. And we have to be very sensitive to whom and from whom that redistribution occurs. And quite often, that formalization goes in the wrong way. Now, in some of the initiatives, particularly in Peru, it was an attempt to make sure that the landless, the squatters, had rights, and that was very important. But in other countries, the formalization is a formalization to give the elites the rights. If you go back to the enclosure movement, which you can say was a formalization, an enclosure movement in the UK and in Scotland, it was formalizing the rights of the elites and throwing out ordinary people from the common use of the land. And so the result of that was a slight increase in inefficiency, but at a cost of enormous increase in inequality.
Thank you very much for your introductory remarks. I did make some points, and I also have prepared 4 points to discuss later. Professor, you covered most of them indirectly, but I will be happy to come back. Let me turn to our second panelist, Mr. Hernando de Soto. Professor Hernando de Soto is a Peruvian economist who is known for his work on the informal economy, also importance of business and property rights, which links us to our topics very strongly. He's the president of Institute for Liberty and Democracy, located in Lima, Peru. But also, Mr. De Soto has a very strong record for working for international economic institutions, being advisor to former presidents of his country. And he's another very well-known economist who we are all pleased accepted the invitation for being with us today. Mr. De Soto, please.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and again with Joe. We've worked together in Switzerland at a certain moment, so we know each other. Well, I thought that yesterday you were superb when you gave your very formal speech. It was fascinating because you went directly into the problems that we face today. I don't know how much you agree, but I think we're going into a very strong, very dangerous recession time. And I want to talk a little bit about that, follow up what you said, and follow up your division of the issues of the rule of law. You said rule of law, as you say, context is everything. But you said there concretely that transparency was an important part of the rule of law, inclusiveness was an important part. In other words, it had to be embedded in society, were your words. And thirdly, you talked about democratic accountability, and I couldn't agree more. Now, what I'd like to do, you've talked about developing countries, I'd like to talk about your country and about property rights in your country. It's always interesting from the window outside looking in. Now, let me tell you why I'm very concerned about property rights in your country, as opposed to in my country. It all started more or less for me, as a personal experience, in September 2008. In September 2008, I don't know where I was, Addis Ababa, say, probably Addis Ababa. I turn on television, and I see the Secretary of your Treasury at that time, Hank Paulson, go out and in front of Nancy Pelosi get on his knee and say, I need $780 billion. $780 billion because we've got a little property right problem. These subprime mortgages have non-performed. So I said, well, terrible, 7%, all these people, the destitute people you're talking about, but what's that got to do with Hank Paulson? He says, the thing is that all of these property rights have been mortgaged, and these mortgages have been turned into mortgage-backed securities, and these mortgage-backed securities have in turn been trading credit debt obligations, and so on, and he shows a generation of about 16 steps, and it ends up in something called the derivatives. And because we don't know where these troubled assets, the toxic assets are, obviously, if they stay there, it will toxify the whole area. So I want to take them out. And I've established a program for that called the Troubled Assets Relief Program. So I'm going after them. And I got to buy them and surgically remove them so that everybody stops thinking of a run on the banks. Good. I move on. I'm in Cairo. Turn on the television 3 weeks later, and the same man announces to the American public, you know, we're going to do something else with that money. We're not going to get those toxic assets. What we're going to do, it's a Gordon Brown idea, is we're going to put in preferred shares into different banks, and we're going to start buying and filling up Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And I said, no, you borrow money for one thing, and you use money the next day, and you don't even consult, you just go out and do it. What happened here? And as you know, Joe, I've got good contacts in Washington, not necessarily on your side of the block, but on the other side of the block for historical reasons. So people talk to me. Being a Peruvian, you know, you can tell me a whole bunch of things that they can't tell you because they get into a fight. With me, it's a Peruvian, who cares? So I went in and went to the White House and I said, why, all of which has been confirmed later on, why didn't you go through Plan A, which was to surgically remove those assets? And the reply I got, can't give names, but I promise you, right at the top, and anyhow, now it's in George Bush's memoirs, is we couldn't find them. We couldn't price them. And so it was complicated. It was better to shore up the banks. But talk about the rule of law. What does the rule of law say? It was a troubled assets program. Assets, in my vocabulary, are property. It's not just a contract. It's somebody owns the risk and somebody owns the land. And they couldn't find it. And how much was it all? Well, about 1 week or 2 weeks later, Chris Cox writes an article in the Wall Street Journal and says, well, the assets we're talking about are a new form of financing and securitizing of financing called derivatives. And we think that there's about $700 trillion of these things floating out there. 700 notional amount. Agreed. Now here's what this means. If the GNP of the United States is $15 trillion, and there's 700 trillion of unknown factors, in which case you don't know which bank owns it, your property rights system makes ours in developing countries look like piddle. You really don't know where things are. And the story goes on. When you're trying to shore up Greece, what is the debt of Greece? Well, they've used the derivatives market to take debts in euros, change them into dollars. They've come back, and that's been registered in the balance of payments as an income instead of the fact that it went out and in. And so every day we start finding out that Greece is in more debt than it looked at. And that's probably peanuts compared to the Italian debt, according to Gustavo Piga, who's been looking at all this up and down. And so you don't really know, moreover, how many French banks are involved in Greece. And so if Greece goes, does France go? And if France goes, does Italy go? And what happens to Germany? So the issue is that the rule of law on property, which was established during the 19th and 20th century between the United States and Europe, which includes transparency. All assets are recorded. Every automobile, every piece of land, every debt, every bond, everything tangible, intangible, the rights to your book, the rights to my book, everything's recorded with one exception, $700 trillion. So the rule of law, when you yesterday said, we have a problem, you were absolutely right, having a problem. I think we are in front of an immense crisis where the most developed countries in the world have forgotten that you have to have transparency, but it's not even transparency. Transparency is the work of our good friend Peter Reigen. It's really about something else. It's about truth. Because a property right doesn't give you a piece of paper that says you own something. That's a small part of any deed. It tells you what the relationships are between different people regarding an issue. So it is like Ludwig Wittgenstein, who established the universe is composed of things in relationship to each other. Really, the property right gives you the narrative of how we all link up together. And today, the highest amount of notional value on paper cannot be traced back, and that's why you're heading to a recession that you just can't avoid, because the biggest problem you have is knowing where the debt is. Okay, now that is the first point. The second point regarding that I think is absolutely crucial is that back home in the United States, all of a sudden we find out that 60% of your mortgages are not under the names of the people who own the mortgages, nor the people who own the houses, because you've taken a software system called MERS and you've done robo-signing, and no longer do the owners sign. And when you've gone to the courts and the banks have gone to the courts to collect. They can't collect in 60% of the cases because in Peru, we know more who the owners are today than Americans do on a legal stance. Locally, everybody knows, but locally, in Nigeria, everybody knows. Locally, in Ghana, everybody knows. The question is, do you know in central information where it's accessible and actionable? So the question here becomes that we are in a very big problem regarding recession, and I think it is a property rights problem. I don't think it's a financial problem. I think that the trick that's been occurred is that things that were governed according to identification. You know, I travel around the world like you do, Joe, and if they ask me who I am, it's in a document. There is no way they can say Hernando. Hernando, who's Hernando? This is what does it. We've come into this conference. This is what does it. Capitalism travels in documents, and Western documents are making less sense every day because they don't give you the whole information. But then, the question, as you say, is inclusiveness. And here is maybe one point. I agree with you that politicians are enormously responsible for this. The only thing I would add is on the right, which you're right about, and on the left. And how is the part on the left? Let me explain. You talked yesterday of the Arab Spring. Okay, what happened in the Arab Spring? First time we hear about the Arab Spring is December 17, 2010. A young man of 26 years old, Tariq Mohammed Bouazizi, lights up in the 38,000 city of Sidi Bouzid, and he puts lighter fluid and lights up. Okay? Now, he's not a proletariat. He doesn't have a mortgage. He's a businessman. He's a street vendor. He's an informal fellow without any property rights. Because he has no property rights, he's got no credit. Microcredit is fine, but it's micro. You know, Steve Jobs starts off from a garage and makes Apple. Everybody in my country that's got microcredit is still in the garage. It hasn't left it. So there is a limit to how much you can go on microcredit. This guy can't get microcredit. What he has is all illegal. So he lights up because they take his wares. He lights up because they take everything he's got, his electronic scale, the crates of apples, the crates of bananas, whatever it is, they take it up and they forbid him to be on the sidewalk because even though he tries to comply with the law, he can't get in the law, and they take away his capital and his resource. Now, here's the thing that's important. He's a poor capitalist. That exists too. He never saw a salary. Like 80% of the people in Tunisia or Peru, they never saw a salary. They see profits. But to identify profits as a poor issue, you've got to do a little bit of penetration. Now, here's the interesting part about it. He lights up, and everybody tells me, you know, these Arab countries are all culturally different. How can you compare the Tuaregs of Libya with the Empire of Egypt? We know it's all its traditions, both local and the one of colonies. But 35 other, we checked it, I put a 5-man team, we saw that all throughout, in 1 month, all throughout the Arab nations, 35 people lit up. And the whole revolution spread like wildfire, and all the 35 were street vendors without credit and without property rights and without homes. Now, of course, what happens in those things is that the guys who can talk are the guys who steal the revolution. You've seen the Mensheviks be taken away by the Bolsheviks. But if we only look at the rights of democracy and we don't look at the economic rights to property, and you don't satisfy these guys who lit up without a political program, you will also see that the Arab Spring, which is to me an entrepreneurial revolution, you know, in Tunisia, they have the Association of Unemployed People, l'Association des Chômeurs. It's not possible. A poor person who's unemployed dies. They starve. And yet there's 60% of them. They're all in the informal economy. They're all capitalists. They're all entrepreneurs. They should also be in the heart of leftists because they're exploited, but not as proletarians. Marx didn't see it, but we're seeing it in front of our eyes. The third point, and with this I end, is democratic accountability, which I think is very important. Now, because, and I end with this, but it's an important example. Now, because the situation is so bad in the West, everything is risky, from gold down to your shares in General Motors. Very risky. So it's coming towards emerging markets. And it's a land grab. You're rushing. Large corporations are rushing. Chinese or otherwise. We'll talk about property rights and the Chinese later on. There's no time now. They come in and they're buying land all over the place, right? And as they move inside, what does the American left bring out? A film called Avatar, in which you see beautiful blue people invaded by white American marine miners. I mean, the whole caboodle combination, which try and take their land and they say, leave our land. Every time we try and title the Amazon in Peru to give the guys of Avatar a property right so they can defend themselves from capitalists, the first people that criticize it is the left. Because why should they have property rights? Because they can be exploited. But how else can they defend their land? An American with a property right has a concession in Peru. He then writes it up in a bilateral investment treaty, then goes to OPIC in the United States, gets another piece of paper on it, then goes to the World Bank, gets another MIGA on it, and then he's got a super duper right, and he faces a few Indians who he will wipe the world with. And guess who agrees with the left-wing foundation that they shouldn't get property rights? The mining companies, of course. So it's a whole world to be discovered, and I think your speech yesterday opens a whole book of discussions that we can get into.
Muchas gracias. Muchas gracias, caballero. With a real Latin American elan, Professor de Soto made his presentation. But
I'm not professor, just by the way.
Mr. de Soto.
He's a professor. I'm a
Mr. de Soto
activist.
made his presentation. Anyway, you cannot deny a Latin American elan. As a moderator, let me resort to Plan B. Plan A, I have prepared my 4 points, because I believe now Professor Stiglitz made his comments in a more general way, while Mr. de Soto, as a matter of fact, reacted to yesterday's speech of Professor Stiglitz. I think it is fair now, Joe, if you want to use the opportunity, whether you don't want immediately to react to some of the points Mr. de Soto made. For me, especially the first point is very interesting, and let me admit I'm not entirely impartial here.
Well, on the first point, I think there's a sense in which he's absolutely right. In a way, this focuses more on the rule of law than the narrow issue of property rights. The question was, to what extent in the whole process of the crisis did they follow the rule of law? At the very beginning, when the Fed acted to bail out AIG, even Paul Volcker raised the question, was this consistent with the law? Now, there's always ambiguity. There was one provision in the law that said you can do certain things under an emergency. And of course, we all know that dictatorships always use that emergency provision to give them a blank check. And the Fed used that emergency provision, interpreted very broadly, to give them license to bail out an insurance company, not a bank, an insurance company, because it was necessary, they thought, for preserving the financial system. Now, there were other ways they could have done it. They could have used the rule of law, conservatorship. We have ways of dealing with overextended banks, but they wanted to transfer, one interpretation, huge amounts of money from the rest of our taxpayers to, as it turned out, after they didn't want to tell us where the money went, but the money that went from AIG then eventually went to Goldman Sachs. They didn't want to tell us, and we finally used the Freedom of Information Act to find that out. And to some other, as well as to some other foreign banks. As I said, Paul Volcker raised the question, was this consistent with the law? And it will never go to court to be resolved. It's water over the dam. In the bill that Hank Paulson brought to Congress, was first rejected. It was a 5-page bill, or maybe 3-page, that said, give me a blank check of $800 billion to do what I want. And Congress rightly said, we don't give blank checks of $800 billion to anybody, even if we trust them. And they weren't sure they trusted him. But it was interesting here, in the actual passage of the bill, there were many of us who believed that the Hank Paulson's approach of TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, I mean, they have such beautiful names for this. They didn't want to call it toxic assets, so they called it troubled assets. And a little later, Geithner changed the name to legacy assets, as if to elevate them from junk all the way to legacy. Sounds good. So, but many of us recognized that they would never be able to price these in a way that was consistent with openness and transparency. In fact, many of us suspected the whole objective was lack of transparency. Because nobody could price it, you could buy it at undervalued prices and transfer a gift to the banks with no one really knowing that had been done. That kind of gift, that kind of transfer at non-market prices has been done all over the world. I as chief economist of the World Bank, I've seen these kinds of transfers within the law, but still really subverting basic principles of economic justice all over the world. And when the crisis began, I thought, and interestingly, the former chief economist of the IMF both thought, we saw this coming in the United States. And it's actually, so we said, if you can't do it in an open and transparent way, you have to figure out another way of doing it. And so we got in the legislation the right for them to do the equity injection. So they weren't violating the law when they did it. It was an explicit provision that was put in there by some of us who said they are never going to succeed in buying the troubled asset because they are inherently non-transparent. Now, let me make a couple of other points here. The first is, this lack of transparency is not an accident. It's deliberate. The banks make money because in non-transparent markets. When you have a competitive market, you can see the principle of economics, intense competition drives prices down to zero, profits down to zero. Competitive markets, when they're really competitive, there are no profits. And in a world without profits isn't very interesting to most of the business community. It's boring. And one of the things that we try to do at the business school is to teach people how to erect non-competitive systems, because they're interested in making money. They're not interested in, that's the point. So how do you create money? You create barriers to entry. You work to create non-competitive situations. And the banks have done a fantastic job at doing that. The interesting thing here is this hasn't changed. With all the regulatory reform, all the statements after 2008 saying we have to reform, nothing's happened. Why? Because the banks know that this is how they make money, and they have resisted transparency. And so we still have non-transparent, over-the-counter derivatives. Why is this important to all of you? Well, right now, there's a risk of another financial meltdown. And the point that Hernando made about 2008 is absolutely true today. No one knows where the liabilities are. No one knows if the Greek bonds go down, which banks in which countries are going to suffer. It's totally murky, totally non-transparent. All within the law, let me make clear. This is the legal framework that we've created. This is the legal framework that they used their money to buy in the United States and in other countries. And that's, why is that so important? Because if you don't know who owes whom what, in the midst of a crisis, the markets will freeze. And when the markets freeze, the credit flow will stop and the economy will go down. So I think this is really important, and he's absolutely right that we still haven't achieved transparency. But there's another aspect of this that I want to emphasize, and that is there's a general theorem, research of mine, my own, with Bruce Greenwald was pointed out, that in the presence of imperfect and asymmetric information, unfettered contracts do not in general lead to economic efficiency. So those of you who may have studied Adam Smith's invisible hand, what we showed is that the reason that the invisible hand often seems invisible is because it's not there. That markets are not in general efficient. So how does this play out in the crisis? Well, people start making contracts freely according to the law, many of them transparent. You have first mortgage owners, second mortgage owners, service providers, and they each do it rationally, and they wind up with a system that is a complete mess. So that when a crisis happens, they can't untangle it. They've gotten themselves all wrapped up in a way that the system is becoming totally dysfunctional. And that's why we need a system. You need some sense of traffic cop. What they've done is got themselves in a gridlock where they've gotten themselves in a mess, and now they can't get themselves out of it. The consequence of, if they were the only ones to suffer, you can say, let that be their problem. But because they've gotten themselves into a mess, and in a way exploiting, engaging in predatory lending against the poorest Americans, millions of Americans are suffering. Our whole economy is suffering. The global economy is suffering. 7 million Americans have lost their homes. We have an economic system that combines homeless people and empty homes. That's not a way a good economic system is supposed to operate. That's the way our system is today functioning.
It was introductory remarks number 2, opening a lot of issues. As somebody who has been for past 14 years linked to Goldman Sachs, let me make one remark, that I always admitted a lot of criticism, but didn't know one thing, why just Goldman Sachs has been picked up as a punching ball. But that's more general remark. But there is one question I would like to raise. I'm also a former politician. I could have imagined how extremely difficult decision back in September 2008, these people, the American politicians, must have faced, and I can very well understand how they must have been under the pressure that if you allow large systemic financial institutions to fail, there will be a huge impact not only for the American economy but the whole global economy. And it's relatively easy to be an independent commentator, professor, academician, or whoever, and to be somebody who is elected and being responsible for the welfare of not only its own nation, his own nation, but for the whole world. As somebody who is an independent economist, as Vladimir Dlouhy, I even have a strong suspicion that if I should decide on my own, I probably even wouldn't save AIG, even Bear Stearns, not only Lehman Brothers. I would just let the whole catastrophe happen in the short term, hoping that through that there will be a much faster boiling out of the problems without such a protracted recession which we might be facing. And I would like to know your opinion. Where is the difference between the rule of law on one thing and the responsibility for the politician, not only for his or her own country, but for the whole global economy? And let's be sure, sitting in Europe, we are not discussing a past in 2008, we are not discussing academic question, but we are discussing the fate of the European or Eurozone today with the immediate impact on the Czech economy. So allow me to raise this question, which was not among my 4 points, but as a moderator, you must be flexible.
Let me
would you like to start?
Yes, I would like to follow up, ahead. Not even start. I think that this whole issue has been well titled, and that's why I enjoyed Joe's remarks yesterday on the rule of law, why he emphasized it. He didn't just say the rule of law. Here's what I think. I'm a third worlder, so I'm an outside observer. I think that basically you Westerners have lost their sense of history. It is not that there is laws and there's a rule of law. The rule of law is something that Joe just mentioned before, which is, you said, there's something informal. That informal thing is basically a social contract. There are a series of principles on which regulations stand. And the question is, what are those principles? Some countries like yours, Joe, believe that you should put them in writing, and you got the amendments and you got the whole thing and the pillars are there. And you've got a Supreme Court and other institutions that safeguard them. In other cases, like the Brits, they believe that you don't finagle with that. You know them, and you should be there. Now, I believe that the law has different stages, and that the fundamental stages of the rule of law, which is not law and order, it's the rule of law, have actually been broken. Back in the 18th and 19th century, Westerners went out and fought against feudalism and patrimonialism, where everything was in a few hands and there was no transparency whatsoever. That was the very characteristic of feudalism. You just didn't know it because common folk didn't have the right to know what rich folk had. That was basically it. When the market economy comes along, when liberals of all sorts come along, they say no more of that. We're going to distribute or redistribute these assets so that everybody can become a property owner. But against that, we're going to record it. And all over the United States, log cabin rights, corn rights, you couldn't even have a gold rush. I mean, first thing you went and took over Mexico, which wasn't yours, by the way, and split it into 800 parts and immediately titled it. Everything's out in the open. So one part of the rule of law always was everything you have is recorded. It's there. It's in all your constitutions. They are recorded. And here come all of these financial types and don't record it. They violated the rule of law. Now, it was done with sleight of hand. What was the sleight of hand? Two departments of law in American universities, property law and contract law. Then a few types start saying, why don't we pass this on to contract law? It's a lot more fluid. It really isn't an asset. It really is finance. Bang! They've been planning this for ages and they screwed you. And in the process, they're going to screw us because there's no way that you can go down without us going down one way or another. First violation of the rule of law. Second one, erga omnes. The rule of property law is all about erga omnes, which is what you mentioned yesterday, which I was so happy to hear you. It is externalities. Erga omnes means that you cannot write a law on property that doesn't take interest of third parties, which is why you have encumbrances, which is why you have easements, which is why you have mortgages. A property record tells you all of that. All of a sudden, derivatives don't give you erga omnes. They left externalities behind. They tricked us. There's a third thing, which is all finance is aligned to improvements. How did you distribute property in the United States when you distributed improvements, right? In other words, somebody had a land, How did you improve it? If you were a railroad company, you put in the rails. Coming in a while. I'm not taking more time than Joe.
I just don't want this panel to be a full criticism of the United States.
No, don't worry. They're not worried about it. They're criticized all over the world. And besides, he started criticizing at the beginning. Don't put us in the criticism of the United States.
Okay.
You Europeans have a problem with that. We
please.
don't. Okay, now, here's the issue. And it's not a criticism of the United States. I'm saying that they have the strong roots. And your roots were, there has to be an improvement. And you said it yesterday. You said that this was derivative instruments which made no improvement whatsoever except their own improvement. So let me just end with this. And by the way, let me extend my criticism to Europe because you're also failing because of your stuff. So everybody's in it. The only people that are not in it is our third worlders, and it's no merit. It's just that our bankers don't know as much as your bankers do. Otherwise, we'd be in it as well. So here's the big issue.
Well, remember times 10 years ago.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't be so proud.
All right. So here we go. There is a violation of the rule of law, and it is one that has a history. And it's got both a leftist and a rightist history. Jefferson, in 1819, in his collection of letters, says this country, the United States, is being ruined. And it's being ruined because a group of bankers have come around and created, and he uses for the first time the term fictitious capital. Capital which has absolutely no backing with property. Marx was 1 year old when he wrote that. Later, Marx comes around and says, these bankers have these problems. So we've seen this before, and they've come back again. And we've seen this before, and the reply is what you said. It's clarity, it's truth, and remembering that finance is to support production, not the other way around.
Can I just answer your question?
Definitely. If only I'm... Hernando, if only I was not a moderator. Joe, please.
Okay. So let me just say, the last point that Hernando made is really important, that finance is supposed to serve production, the rest of our society, not just production, but the rest of our society, rather than the other way around, which is the way it's been. On the particular question that you asked is, could we have did we have to bail out the banks in the way we did to save the market economy? Do we have to violate, in some sense, the rule of law? And the answer is, in my view, no. We had on the books in the United States laws that dealt with how to deal with banks that couldn't pay what they owed. They're called laws about conservatorship. And what the big mistake that we made was confusing saving the bank with saving the bankers. Saving the bankers' shareholders, saving the bankers' bondholders. So we could have saved, say, take Citibank, for instance. It had over $300 billion of long-term bondholders. So rather than shoveling money in from the U.S. government, we could have gone through and said, we're going to restructure. We go through bankruptcy. In the case of banks, we call it conservatorship. There's some details in the law about how you do it. And the basic difference between bankruptcy and conservatorship is that in the case of bankruptcy, you wait until the firm can't pay its bills. In the case of banks, where they're entrusted with other people's money, you don't want to wait that long. When you put your ATM card, your debit card, into the ATM machine and it comes back saying insufficient funds, you want it to be because there are insufficient funds in your bank account, not because the bank has insufficient funds. So we have rules that say that you close down banks before they hit that bottom. But when they do that, the shareholders are supposed to lose everything. The bondholders become the next source of protection. And only if the bondholders and the shareholders get all wiped out and there's nothing left, does the taxpayer come in to protect the depositor. Because it's important to protect the depositor because you don't want runs on banks. So this basic principle has been the principle of banking system. And unfortunately, both the Bush and the Obama administration simply did not understand that, or more accurately, I think they did understand it, but they got captured by the banks. And it's not just your bank, it was all of the banks that they got captured by, but and the result of it was that money flowed from taxpayers to protect the bondholders and the shareholders, and that was the big mistake.
Maybe, but weren't we, because both you and me inconsistent, when both you and me today, we expressed our reservation about bailing out in the US back in 2008, but yesterday in the noon TV discussion here in the Czech Republic, we both supported, maybe both of us for slightly different reasons, necessary stabilization steps of Eurozone towards Greece and general debt crisis, because it is also a violation of the existing rules and formal setup in different member countries of the Eurozone, obviously under the flag of saving the Eurozone economy, preventing the other crisis. So isn't that a certain inconsistency between what we said yesterday and what we are saying here today?
No, I mean, to the extent that the problem in Europe has to do with the banking system, I would say we should follow exactly the same procedures. The shareholders and the bondholders are the ones who should be the first line of defense, and only then, only if there's not enough money, we will have to protect the financial system, but it's only after the shareholders and the bondholders have paid the price that we come in with government assistance. The issue of sovereign debt is a more complicated one, and we don't have a good legal framework for sovereign debt, and how to restructure it. And that was so clear in the case when Argentina had its problems, and it had to be restructured. There isn't any real, there's no bankruptcy court they can go to. There's no international law that applies. In the aftermath of the Argentinian crisis, there was an initiative to try to create an international regime, but unfortunately the Bush administration vetoed it. And so a decade later, we're left in the same state that we were at the time, Argentina. We have no orderly way of doing it. And what Europe is trying to do is to say, look, we need to have an orderly way, because if we don't have an orderly way, the consequences could be very severe. So it's really, this is a case where the lack of a set of rules of international law is really causing a problem. Now, yesterday when we were talking about it, part of the problem in the Euro region is that the project of creating a euro went faster than the economic project was faster than the political project. So that when the euro was created, it didn't have the set of other institutions that would be necessary to make a common currency work. And there was a hope that over time those institutions would be created, but it hasn't happened. There was a hope in January of 2010, with the Greek crisis just beginning, there was a hope that something would be done very quickly. Didn't happen. And now there's still the hope, a year and a half later, that as the crisis has gotten worse, Europe will finish the task, to finish the economic project that it began a decade ago. And it's an open question.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that? But let's not dwell on Europe and Euro too long.
Let's not what, sorry?
Let's not dwell on Euro too long.
Sure.
Yeah. Please.
I can be moderate. So, I think there's another interesting issue here, you know, Joe, which is something that the Europeans forget. Now, let's take another stance. I'll criticize Latin America later. But there's a memory problem here. The memory problem consists of the following thing. Back in the 19th century, I forget exactly where, there were some economists that were saying, you know, it's a pity that we've used the word money. We should have used the word moneyness. Now, what's behind that? The whole idea behind that is that there's all sorts of liquidity in the world. And part of it is currency, what the Fed issues, or the Central Reserve Bank of England, Mervyn King. And there's other stuff that has value and that has currency. I mean, you can't go out with a mortgage and buy a pack of cigarettes, but it's there and it can serve to have a financial operation. So then we have the fractional reserve system. And I think that one of the problems is that the monetarists, just like the finance types have taken over, the monetarists have taken over as if the only liquidity in the West was money. In fact, what the fractional bank system does is that Mr. Bernanke puts out, I don't know, 100 units of gold and says, you need 100 units of gold before you can loan 1,000 units, or whatever it is. But what the banks loan out is not that 100, because that 100 can't cover 10 times that amount. What they use is all sorts of other types of information to either collateralize or feel assured. And that information is property information. How does property information come in? How do you know how much assets you've got? One is, of course, records. And we've just seen that MERS and the other ones have screwed things up. The other one is you should be recording, like bonds, you should be recording the derivatives. One is not. There's a third one, which is balance sheets. The balance sheet evolved to control companies, their assets, liabilities, and equity. And then the US government, like European governments, said, now standardize it, so this is a way we can know if you're a healthy company, if you're over-leveraged or you're not over-leveraged, at least to a point of great danger. Enron breaks, and we try and find out how many balance sheets they have. 3,200. You go to a Peruvian bank, one balance sheet. So emerging markets, we do what you told us to do. But in your cases, you've created special purpose entities for real, cool, absolute liquid financing. And so what happens is that when all of a sudden you take away mark to market, no longer do you put as prices what you can get on the market, but what is fair. Hey, we did that during our best dictatorships. What's fair? Your special purpose entities don't work. Your land records don't work. You haven't titled your biggest financial device. You, and this is your area, asymmetry, you have no information. And so the question is, can you bring out $1, $2, $3 billion from your Central Reserve Bank when your real problem is private credit contraction, which is not based on monetary stuff, but the assurances and the information, the truthful, transparent information that property rights should be giving you.
Again, would you like to discuss, or can we move ahead a little bit?
Go ahead.
Okay. Let me move to a rather sensitive area here. This country inherited in December 1989 a completely nationalized economy. Even among the former communist countries, the former Czechoslovakia used to be the most nationalized. Even the small and medium-scale businesses were basically nationalized. There was virtually no private sector. There was a huge political and also economic demand, not speaking about the advices from abroad, for a very mass and quick privatization, which we did using also the famous, or you would say, maybe some people would say infamous, voucher scheme privatization. Later, with the problem with the Asian crisis 97-98 and collapse of the Russian economy and former Soviet economies, there was a lot of reconsideration in the West for the advice you gave us, which got the name so-called Washington Consensus, and we were, to put it simple, very much criticized for being too fast in the introduction of the economic reforms and putting the policies right. And we forgot about the institution and legal framework. And after the Asian crisis and after the collapse of the Russian economy and also problems we in this country and elsewhere had, there was obviously this rule of law slogan which emerged very, very strongly. But if I look back, even open for the criticism, what is, as a matter of fact, a legal system in a particular moment of the time? What was the legal system back in 1991 when this country started to decide about mass privatization? And my bottom line is that legal system is always in the state of flux. The regulatory framework of Western Europe and the United States was given to us and also to the third world countries as an example. But only 10 or 15 years later, the same countries came to the conclusion that their regulatory framework didn't prevent the repetition of the biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression. So if you look back at the criticism of the so-called Washington Consensus, where Professor Stiglitz, I know you were one of the most vocal critics, how would you answer my question about the fact that the legal system is always in the state of flux? And if you would like to achieve a privatization of such a mass scale as we were facing, or if you want to pursue any other important transformatory change in the economic performance, on the large changes on the economic policy, my answer would be that simply you should just go pragmatically ahead, even when you are going to suffer some backlashes later.
Well, I think the first point that you made is a correct one, that legal systems are always in flux. And legal systems are man-made constructions. We have to have a clear view of where we want to go, what we want to use them for. We need to know the lessons of where they haven't worked well. There are always going to be flaws. There are always going to be problems. The difficulty, or my concern, was that the economic framework on which the Washington Consensus policies were based was basically flawed and outdated. It was based on the notion that markets were self-regulating. You strip away regulation, you make sure you have private incentives in place, and things will work well. Economic theory had explained why that was not true, and that it was a very risky strategy. And those predictions turned out to be true. Kinds of criticisms that I raised, saying that deregulation, financial deregulation, for some of the reasons that Hernando has said, I looked at it as an economist more than as a lawyer, but that system, it was inevitable that that financial system would break down. So the issue of the mindset behind the Washington Consensus deregulation and privatization was just simply out of touch with modern economics, and was one that was, I viewed, extremely risky. And we now know that the world is paying a huge price, and the United States is paying a huge price for that mistake. There's another aspect that I was concerned with, not so much as an economist, but in terms of just as an economist, but the nature of the society, that if you didn't do privatization in the right way, for instance, you can wind up with a society with a high degree of inequality. If you didn't do privatization right, you could wind up with a society with a high degree of inequality, and that inequality could in turn undermine democratic reform. Now, the countries in Eastern Europe, I think, had a big advantage and a very big difference from Russia, because they were joining the EU. And the EU was providing a legal framework, a stability, a political stability. But you look at another part of the economies in transition, Russia. And I think that the rapid privatization led to the creation of an oligarchy. And that oligarchy, I don't think, and most of us looking at Russia would say today that it's a true democracy. Whether, if it had done privatization differently or not followed the Washington Consensus, they would have wound up at a different place. That's a counterfactual history. But what is clear is that those of us who were concerned about that dynamic were rightly concerned. The other side said, don't worry, because once we create property rights, we will wind up, they will demand a good legal system. And my response to that is the demand for antitrust competition law doesn't come from people like Bill Gates and Rockefeller. They like non-competitive situations. If we're going to get competition, we have to have an underlying economic framework that demands it, and not one that's run by a set of oligarchs. So the decisions you make at one time does affect the history at the next moment of time. And you were anchored because of Europe. Russia didn't have that anchor, and I'm afraid that as we've seen the evolution, some of those early mistakes are likely to be long-lived in their consequence.
Allow me very shortly 3 comments. First, I believe the countries of Central Europe, Poland, Czech, Slovak, Slovenia, Hungary, their main anchor was not so much Europe or European Union, despite the fact that it played a very strongly role, but we have our own historical democratic anchor. That was crucial. Second, it's my very strong feeling that if we had waited for the proper legal framework, institutional framework in place, we wouldn't have been able to privatize so quickly as we did, and without that probably wouldn't have seen the re-emergence of the economic growth. And the third, the quality of putting proofs by eating. And the Central European economies, Poland, Czech, Slovak, Slovenia, to a less extent Hungary, but because of the recent policies, are able to weather the existing crisis much better than people expected at the beginning of the crisis. So it is, at least for me, a proof that we were able to lay down the very basic cornerstones of our economic performance, even despite not having, and that I 100% admit, a proper regulatory and legal framework from the very beginning. Would you like to make the comments on this issue, or? Sure.
No, following up what you've said and what Joe was saying before, and I'm of course extremely interested in what Joe feels. I get my own feeling when with all the numbers we don't have, with all the hands in different pockets that we don't know what arm they belong to. But the fact that we don't know, when you've got the likes of a man like Lamfalussy in the Bank of International Settlements failing with Basel I and Basel II and III to get the banks to tell us what they've got and what contracts they got, and they still don't give them, and they still don't vote yes. And when you get the IMF giving political messages instead of telling banks what to do, I get the feeling that the whole, not only the Washington consensus, the whole San Francisco thing, whatever was good at that time when we start off with a clean slate, has sort of been outdated. They don't have the authority. How can you navigate without information? I mean, how can there be markets without knowledge? I mean, the whole idea of knowledge identification is because you're going to operate on a large scale. Market is not Asterix and Obelix talking to each other. Markets are when you talk to Chinese you never met, and it doesn't matter because he's got a price. He knows what he's going to talk about. He's got an address. So the question is, in this world that we don't have this information, and that is basically being taken by speculators. Actually, speculating is a good idea. It means thinking. But, you know, people who have obviously made money at all our expense, because we know we're going to have to pay for that, and we are already paying for that, and we'll probably pay in spades as we go along. I wonder, Joe, if we haven't actually come to a time when this order has been exhausted. It's been exhausted, and like all things, unfortunately, in our history, hopefully it's not going to be a war, but it is a crisis that makes you go to the dentist. It's a crisis that makes you go to psychiatry, and it's a crisis that will make these people start talking seriously one day.
Well, that we discussed slightly yesterday noon as well, whether our Euro-Atlantic civilization in the 21st century will not still be strong, but on a kind of a slowly declining trend, and whether a completely new model is not going to re-emerge during the 21st century. I would love to continue in this discussion with these two excellent economists, but because we are coming to an end, and I have promised I will also allow for some questions for the floor, we have time for 2 or 3, but please quick and up to the point questions. I see 2 gentlemen. The hand was first on the left-hand side from my point of view. Please, go ahead. Can we have a mic?
Yeah, there it is.
Mr. De Soto puts property rights central to the rule of law, and to what extent do you think that that is true, Professor Stiglitz?
Thank you for a short and up-to-the-point question, Professor Stiglitz. Well, I think the way we've been talking about it, I think has helped clarify the issue. Property rights are only one part of the system, and that's why I pointed out that the Grameen Bank has actually, in many countries, been more successful, microcredit, at extending credit to the very poor than the extension of property rights. But there are limits, and as Hernando pointed out, microcredit doesn't help create enterprises that are going to create jobs. So when you start getting into the larger scale, you need to have more formal institutions, and that's just one example. Property rights have to be properly defined. They have to have this kind of transparency that he's emphasized. They have to have a recognition of responsibilities and restrictions, so that the notion of unfettered property rights is really a misunderstanding of what is needed to make a market economy work. But property rights are only one part of a broader economic system. Interestingly, I was in a discussion, a debate at the beginning of China's transition to a market economy back in 1980. There was a discussion, for instance, there are a whole set of things that you need to make a successful market economy. But their response was, we can't do everything at one time. Which is more important? Is it more important to try to create property rights, clear property rights, a whole legal framework, or to get competition going? And several of us, Ken Arrow and I, said trying to get competition going is probably more important than dotting the I's and clarifying all the property rights. Eventually you're going to need the property rights, and that was really the strategy that they took. They didn't have a lot of clarity on property rights. They had a lot of competition, TVEs, township and village enterprises, different and competing in the West, and they had the most phenomenal economic growth over the next 30 years. So those are examples of successes at different levels, micro level, poverty reduction, macro level, that have been done without the emphasis on property. But that doesn't say that over time property rights are important, but they have to be appropriately defined. What are the restrictions? One example of the kind of ambiguity is intellectual property rights. What are the boundaries? Again, like all law, it's man-made. The attempt to use intellectual property rights, make them overly broad, so that people in developing country can't get access to life-saving medicine, seems to me wrong. And so that's a case where intellectual property rights are causing unnecessary deaths of thousands and thousands of people. Should you have the right, in the United States, we're having right now a very big legal battle, that there are 2 genes which, if you have those 2 genes, the probability of getting breast cancer is over 50%. Now, the owner, believe it or not, in American intellectual property law, somebody can own those genes. There's somebody who wants to be able to provide the test of those genes for nothing. It's important because if you have the genes, you want to take all kinds of preventive, to be very cautious and so forth. The owner of the gene says, no, we will only let you do it if you pay $5,000 or so. A lot of Americans don't have health insurance. Health insurance companies may not pay for the test, and people will die. The district court in the United States said it was not part of intellectual property right. The appellate court just recently said that's wrong. People can't own those genes. Well, this is a question of society to define where the boundaries are. And I think in that case, we're defining it in the wrong way, or at least the appellate decision said it was the wrong way. And there are whole sets of issues of that kind, but that's where the boundaries of property rights, the restrictions, the protections, the responsibilities are really something that have to be part of, as Hernando said, embedded in society, and we have to debate that, democratic accountability and transparency.
Hernando, please, short comment because we are running out of time.
Sure, of course. Well, you know, obviously, you need various things happening at the same time. You need competition, there's no doubt. I mean, that's the difference between the Soviet Union and the modern world, competition. There's no doubt about it. Or between kingdoms and a democratic society. Even in ideas, you need competition. Everything is born in friction of competition. Now the question is, you know, what comes first, competition, or is it property rights? I think we would have a great debate on that would last a few days. Of course, from the property rights point of view, I think that it gets a bad name, among other things, because as it evolved, it went from being in the 18th and 19th century a very revolutionary word, because it meant that the king didn't have it all, and the blue blood didn't have it, to becoming a Ronald Reagan word. And so it now has this right-wing touch that among Europeans and Americans sounds bad. But I insist that it is really a bad word. Maybe the best word is who controls the assets. And if you have a question of control, how can you possibly have competition if you don't know who controls what? Which is what's happening now, which is now what's happening with the banks. So I believe that property rights has got a very important role to play. You can't have competition unless you know who owns what thing. These are people who own different things. The whole idea of the division of labor is essentially one of being able to know who divides property as well. And last but not least, it's important in everything. It's even important in credit. If you think of the Merchant of Venice, I think we all read in school The Merchant of Venice, Shylock, who gives you credit, since you're both into the world of credit, gives a credit. Joe, do you remember how much the credit was? No, but do you remember the pound of flesh? Yeah. The property, the collateral. So I think property is very important.
Well, let me apologize to all others. I have been given a very strict word from the organizers, and also I said that I'm going to teach from 2 o'clock. So let me conclude, and I will not make any professional conclusion because I do not feel apt and ready to generalize the conclusions of these two most distinguished economists and very nice gentlemen. Anyway, I believe it was a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much to both of you for coming to Prague, to participating at Forum 2000, and to participating at this panel. And thank you very much for your patience.